I keep coming back to the arms. That's the detail I can't shake. Every time I try to talk myself out of what I saw those 3 nights, I get to the arms and I stop. Because there's no version of what I saw where the arms were normal. We've lived in this neighborhood for about 4 years. My wife and I, our dog Cleo, the whole routine. It's quiet in the way suburbs near the edge of town tend to be quiet. The kind of street where the houses have good separation between them, lots on the larger side, and the back of our property bumps up against a tree line that runs maybe a quarter mile before it opens onto the county road. Not a deep forest, but thick enough that once you're past the first row of trees, you can't see anything. At night, that whole stretch of woods just becomes a wall of black. I have a sleep problem. Always have. My wife is out in under 5 minutes. She has the kind of brain that just lets go when the lights go off, and I have always been jealous of that. I end up downstairs most nights around 2 a.m., sitting in this armchair by the front window, lights off, just decompressing until my brain winds down enough to go back up. It works better than any app or supplement I've tried. Something about the stillness of an empty street at that hour. I saw it first on a Tuesday in October. I was sitting in the chair, not really focused on anything, just staring at the street the way you stare at a wall when your mind goes quiet. And I noticed a figure walking up the road. Walking in the road, not the sidewalk, which registered somewhere in the back of my head as slightly off, but not alarming. It happened at a distance, maybe 4 or 5 houses down, and I didn't think anything of it at first. People walk at night. Insomnia isn't unique to me. And then I noticed the arms. They were hanging too low, not swinging the way arms swing when you walk, not the natural pendulum motion, not even the reduced swing of someone with their hands in their pockets. They were just hanging, slightly forward of where arms should hang, and they seemed too long. Not dramatically, not some cartoon long thing, just a few inches wrong. Just enough that once you registered it, you couldn't stop registering it. And the stride had a quality I keep struggling to describe, like watching someone who had learned to walk by watching other people walk and was carefully executing the memory of it. Every step was a little too considered, a little too deliberate, like it was running an internal checklist. I told myself it was someone who'd had a few drinks. The weird arms, the odd walk, the road instead of the sidewalk. Drunk, obviously. The figure stopped in front of my house. Not at the driveway, in the road, directly out front, facing the house. Not looking at a house number, not checking a phone. Just standing and facing the house like it was listening to something inside. I couldn't see the face from where I was sitting. It was dark, and the nearest streetlight was at the corner, too far to reach. But the orientation was unmistakable. I sat there for probably 4 minutes, completely still, and the figure stood there the whole time. Then it just started walking again, continued up the street, and turned the corner. Gone. I sat in the chair for another half hour. I didn't tell my wife. I convinced myself it was a person having a bad night. Came back to bed and lay there until 6. 2 nights later it came back, and it was closer. I hadn't planned to watch for it. I was just in the chair the same way I always am. But when I looked at the street, it was already there. Not starting from 4 houses down, starting from 2. Same arms, same deliberate stride, same quality of movement that made my skin go tight in a way I couldn't explain. It stopped in front of the house again, same position. This time I leaned toward the window. I was trying to see the face. I was maybe 8 feet from the glass, and the more I looked, the less certain I was that there was a face there, in the way there should be a face. Not that it was absent, just that the details felt unresolved. Like looking at a face in a dream where you know it's a face, but when you try to focus, the features don't hold. It stood there for longer that time, 5 or 6 minutes, maybe more, then walked on. I told my wife in the morning. To her credit, she took it seriously. Security camera ordered that afternoon, non-emergency police line called, deadbolts checked. The guy on the phone was polite and clearly thought I'd seen someone out for a late walk. Reasonable. My wife thought the same thing and I couldn't argue with her. I could barely explain what was wrong about it. The camera arrived 2 days later, but the third night came before I could get it set up. I came downstairs and sat in the chair, and it was already at the end of my driveway. Not walking, already there. Standing at the foot of the driveway looking up at the window. I know how that sounds, and I know I've said I couldn't see the face clearly, but there was no other interpretation for the way it was positioned. Whatever was standing out there had clocked exactly which window I sat in every night. It wasn't facing the house generally. It was oriented directly at the window. At me. Cleo, who had been asleep on the couch behind me, woke up. She stood, walked to the edge of the cushion, and stared toward the window. She made a sound I've never heard her make before or since. Not a bark, not a proper growl, more like a sustained low vibration in her chest, continuous and toneless. She didn't move. She just stood there on the couch making that sound and staring at the window. I don't know how long I sat there. My sense of time in that moment wasn't reliable. Long enough that my legs got stiff. Long enough that the cold crept into the room from the gap under the door. The figure stood at the end of my driveway the whole time. Then it turned, and the way it turned was wrong. Something about the mechanics of it, the relationship between how the head moved and how the shoulders moved, not quite how a body should rotate. And it walked to the corner and went into the dark space between two houses, and I never saw it again. I got the camera up the next morning, watched the footage every night for almost 4 weeks. Nothing. Cleo doesn't sit near the front window anymore. She used to love that spot, spent every evening up there watching the street. Now if I put her there, she jumps down and goes to the back of the house. Every time, without exception. I still sit in the chair. I can't tell you why. Maybe habit. Maybe I'm still watching for it. Maybe some part of me wants to see it one more time just to confirm that I know the difference between a person and whatever that was. Because that's the thing that stays with me. It looked like a person. It was shaped like a person. It walked like a person if you didn't know what you were looking at. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee what was wrong. And Cleo saw it too. That's the part my wife doesn't have an explanation for. And neither do I. My brother Danny has this specific laugh. I'm leading with that because whenever I tell this story, the part people get stuck on is always, "How did you know it was him?" And that's the answer. The laugh. It's this loud, slightly nasal thing that starts before whatever he thinks is funny has finished happening. Our mom used to say he laughed at the anticipation of the joke. It's completely distinctive. There's nobody else alive who laughs like Danny. Whatever was standing in the woods behind my rental house on a June night last year knew that laugh exactly. I was renting outside the city at the time, a single-story place about 20 minutes from downtown. The kind of older construction that's always a little drafty in winter, but the landlord's a decent guy named Phil who fixes things eventually. The backyard was a decent size, 60 feet of grass before you hit my fence, and then past the fence another stretch of scrub brush before the actual tree line. A thick stand of oak and pine that ran back into what the county had bought from a logging operation years ago. When I moved in, I liked the privacy of it. I liked the feeling of the woods being back there. That changed after June. It was a Friday night, that stretch of early summer when the heat is just starting to get serious. I was on the back porch with a beer watching the yard, fireflies just starting up, the temperature finally tolerable after a week of humidity. My phone was on the table. I'd talked to Danny that afternoon. He was dealing with a landlord dispute out in Phoenix. Nothing unusual, just needed to vent. And then we'd hung up and that was that. I heard his laugh from behind the fence. Exactly that laugh. The early one. I sat forward and set down my beer. My first thought, genuinely my first thought, not some delayed rationalization, was that he'd driven out as a surprise. That he'd somehow gotten on a plane after we talked and was in my backyard. Because the laugh was that precise. I actually ran that scenario through my head. I thought, Danny's here. Then I heard my name. His inflection on my name specifically, the way he says it when he's been waiting and you've finally clocked him. Patient. Slightly amused at you for taking so long. I stood up. I had my hand on the screen door handle, and then I stopped. Because something didn't line up. Not with the sound. The sound was perfect. Something didn't line up with the facts. It was 11:30 at night, and there were no lights past my fence, and the gate was latched from the inside, and Danny was in Phoenix, and even if he'd dropped everything and flown out after we talked, it was physically impossible for him to be in my backyard right now. I did the math without deciding to. I stood at the screen door with my hand on the handle, and the voice said my name again from somewhere past the fence. Still patient. Still Danny. My back neighbor's motion sensor had tripped, but it faced their yard, so I was only getting the edge of that light, just enough to see as far as my own fence. Past the fence was dark. The voice was coming from somewhere in that dark, from the scrub, or from the near edge of the trees. I couldn't see anything out there. I stood there for a full minute, maybe more. Not frozen, I want to be clear about that. More like genuinely deliberating. Part of my brain was still running the, maybe it's actually him calculation, because the sound was so specific that I kept trying to build a version of events where it made sense. That's the thing that bothers me most when I look back on it. It wasn't fear that kept me at the door. It was wanting it to be real. One more time. My name, from the dark, in Danny's voice. I let go of the door handle. I stepped back. I went inside and locked both doors and sat down at the kitchen table with all the lights on and waited. My phone rang 7 minutes later. Danny calling from Phoenix, wanting to follow up on something he'd forgotten to mention that afternoon. I answered on the first ring and didn't say anything for long enough that he asked what was wrong. I told him in the morning, after I'd slept some. He didn't make any jokes, which told me he believed me even if he didn't say it in those words. I went out to the back fence the next day. Daylight, coffee, the full security of a normal morning. Past the fence there was a section of scrub brush that had been flattened, not torn up, nothing violent, just pressed down the way brush presses down when something's been standing in it for a while. The shape of it was large, and the branches on the first few trees in the tree line were broken back, snapped in the direction of something moving away from the fence, going deeper into the trees. It had been standing there for long enough to settle into the brush. It had been standing there at the right angle to see my porch, and when it was done, it left. I called the non-emergency line. The officer was kind and filed it under noise disturbance, wildlife possible. I understand. There's no report that covers this. I broke my lease in August. Phil, my landlord, was understanding. More understanding than I expected, actually. I mentioned that I was leaving because something about the property made me uncomfortable, and he got quiet in a specific way, and then said that I wasn't the first tenant to leave early. I asked him how many had left early. He changed the subject. I don't go anywhere isolated at night anymore. Not by choice. There's something that happens to you when you hear a voice that isn't the right person. Something that knows your name in someone else's mouth and uses it to try to get a door open. It changes how you relate to dark spaces. I almost went out. That's the thing I sit with. I had my hand on the door. If the math hadn't caught up with me in those last seconds, I would have opened it. I don't know what would have happened if I had. I don't want to know. But sometimes, I think about the fact that it knew which laugh would make me believe. That it listened to us on the phone that afternoon, got the sample it needed, and was ready by 11:30. That level of patience is what keeps me from sleeping some nights. Not the darkness, not the woods, the patience. My neighborhood is one of those places that looks perfectly normal during the day and makes you uneasy at night without being able to explain why. The houses are close together, but not too close. Everyone has a backyard that backs up to the same tree line, a thick strip of woods that separates our street from the undeveloped land behind it. Nice place to raise a family, the realtor said. Good school district. Quiet. The neighbor to my left was a guy named Dave. Mid-50s, retired, spent most of his time in the garage or out in the garden along his fence line. We weren't close friends, but we had that comfortable neighbor relationship where you wave when you pull in the driveway and occasionally stop to talk for 5 minutes about nothing. He drove a white pickup, had a dog that barked at everything, and wore the same tan jacket almost every day. You know the type. This started on a Tuesday in late October. I was in the kitchen making coffee around 7:15 in the morning, and I glanced out the window the way you do when you're waiting for something to brew. Nothing on my mind, just looking. Dave was standing in his backyard near the fence. Nothing weird about that on its own. He was out there all the time. But something made me look twice. I couldn't tell you what exactly. Just that wrongness you feel before you can name it. A splinter in the back of the brain. He was standing very still, facing the tree line. The tan jacket, the same build, the gray at the sides of his hair. Everything matched, but he wasn't doing anything. Just standing there with his arms at his sides, staring at the woods. I figured he was watching something. A deer, maybe. The woods behind our houses push deer out into the yard sometimes. I poured my coffee and went to get ready for work and didn't think about it again until that evening. When I got home, I was pulling into my driveway and I happened to look over at Dave's yard. He was standing in almost the same spot. Same stillness, same posture. It was nearly 6 o'clock and starting to get dark, and he was just standing there facing the trees. I almost called out to him, but something stopped me. Some instinct I didn't understand yet. I went inside instead. That should have been where I started paying attention. It wasn't. The third morning I saw him again. Same spot, same posture. I'm not a superstitious person, and I'm not someone who jumps to conclusions, so I spent about a week rationalizing it. He likes being outside in the morning. He's a retired guy with nothing to do. Old people have routines. Whatever. But I started watching more carefully, and that's when things got harder to explain. His dog stopped going to that side of the yard. The dog who barked at everything, other dogs, squirrels, the mail carrier, sometimes just air, went completely quiet whenever the figure was standing out there. The dog would sit at the sliding glass door and stare at the backyard but wouldn't go out. Dave never seemed to notice. Or whoever I was looking at never seemed to notice. Because that's where I need to stop and be precise. I started to seriously wonder if the person I was watching was actually Dave. The jacket was right. The build was right. The hair was right. But I never saw his face clearly. Not once. He was always turned away, always facing the tree line, and on the few occasions I saw him from a slight angle, something just didn't land right. Like someone had described Dave to an artist who had never seen him, and the artist had done their best. I tested myself. I reminded myself I'd seen Dave hundreds of times, and I knew what he looked like. And then I'd look at the figure in the yard and try to confirm it. And I couldn't. One morning I waved. I was standing at my kitchen window. The figure was out there, and I raised my hand. He turned his head. Slowly, like he was hearing something he hadn't expected. And then he raised one hand and waved back. The movement was wrong. I don't know how to explain it more precisely than that. It was a wave. It had all the right components. Hand raised, side to side, lowered again. But the timing was off by just enough that it felt like watching a video with the audio half a second out of sync. The gesture was technically correct, but there was something mechanical in it. Like something had seen waving before and was now performing it from memory. I went over to knock on Dave's door that afternoon. He wasn't home. His truck wasn't in the driveway. The dog barked and barked from somewhere inside the house. I texted him. We'd exchanged numbers years ago for some neighborhood watch thing, and asked if everything was okay. He texted back within a few minutes. Said he was good. Had been at his daughter's place in Albany all week. Was he expecting a package? I said no. Must have mixed up some dates. We left it at that. He had been in Albany all week. So who was standing in his yard every morning? I went back through my memory of every time I'd seen the figure, 5 or 6 mornings, at least twice in the evenings, always in the same section of the yard, always facing the trees. I didn't want to go out there and look at that patch of ground, but I made myself do it that weekend. The grass was pressed down in a rough area about 2 feet wide. Not footprints, more like something had stood in the same general spot so many times that the weight had just compressed everything flat. At the edge of the yard where the lawn met the tree line, I found a mark on the wooden fence post. At about shoulder height if you were standing on the other side of it. It looked like something had grabbed it, hard enough and long enough to wear the paint down and leave faint impressions in the wood itself. 4 marks, like fingers, but the spacing was wrong for a human hand. Too wide, too far apart. Dave came back the following Sunday. I watched him pull into the driveway from my window and felt something I can only describe as relief. Real Dave, normal Dave. He unloaded a bag from the truck and waved at me, and the wave was normal and right and completely human. And I nearly went outside just to hear him say something mundane about the weather. I never saw the figure again after that. But here's what I keep coming back to, months later. Whatever it was, it didn't stand there watching Dave's house from the outside. It stood in Dave's yard, wearing Dave's shape, facing the woods. Like it wasn't mimicking him for our benefit. Like it was mimicking him for whatever was out there in the tree line. I don't know what that means. I've turned it over for months and I still don't. But I've stopped waving at people through windows. Some things you don't want confirmed.